Hello, everyone. How's it going?
It's good. It's good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm Nolan, Earnest.
I'm Rosie Fordham.
And I'm Simeon Ramirez.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And today we're doing a podcast.
We are. What is it about, Simeon?
Alaska Native civil rights leaders.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. So we've done some studying of Alaska Native history over the past semester, and I was most interested by the civil rights activism of Alaska Native people, and I think the most interesting part of it for me was how much earlier it was than the big civil rights movement that everyone's aware of in the US and globally. The civil rights movement of African Americans in the southern United States. So the Alaskan movement started well before
Yeah.
the movement down south.
Yeah, it did. I remember, so the first bill that they proposed was in 1943, and that actually got rejected, sadly. But it didn't actually take that much time afterward, due to a lot of protesting and movements in Juneau to get the bill passed in 1945.
Yeah, and one of those protests wasn't just all down south in Alaska. There was also protests up north.
In Nome.
Yeah, so a young Native woman called Alberta Schenck decided one day that she was fed up with the segregation that was occurring in Nome, and she went and sat in the white-only section of the movie theater, which draws interesting parallels to Rosa Parks sitting in the white-only section on a Montgomery bus. But that actually happened 14 years later than Alberta's sitting in the white-only section of the movie theater.
Yeah. It's interesting that, I mean, as someone who was raised in Alaska and got an Alaskan education, public education, I should say, it's interesting. I don't think I was ever told or talked, we never talked about these things in class. These people, specifically Alberta, and I do find that interesting because I think nationally, Rosa Parks is respected as a great civil rights leader.
Yeah, I think add to that also internationally. Rosa Parks was someone I heard of at our high school in Australia about the great civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And how much of a role she played. But to think that there were other acts of Alaska Native people before her time and before her movement is very interesting, and I think it's something that we should be educated more about, because it's really cool to know that these weren't, originally I thought this was sort of like a copycat act almost, as in she saw something cool happen and was like, oh, I'm going to do the same thing. But to hear that it was before shows a lot about Alaska Native people wanting their rights and wanting to fight back against discrimination.
And so, why do you guys think that maybe these Alaska Native civil rights leaders aren't so much widely discussed as the other civil rights leaders that we know more about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Well, one thing we discussed was just the fact that Alaska wasn't a state at the time, right? So it was a territory. I mean, it already has its disadvantages of being physically separate from the other states, and I think that does play a factor in regards to news and other communications among the states. I feel like present day wise, the way Alaska is treated is it's usually only in relation to oil when it gets that attention, I feel like.
Yeah, I think people see Alaska as sort of a different part. It's not really thought of as the forefront of the US, and it's definitely seen as an afterthought to a lot of people down in the lower 48. And so I think that definitely comes into play when we think about why we haven't learnt about these people, and why we don't know really about how important Alaska Native leaders were in global civil rights movements and in the push for anti-discrimination acts. As we see, they happen 19 years before the National Civil Rights Act of 1964. Alaska had already passed an anti-discrimination act. So we were far and wide ahead of the rest of the country in stopping discrimination, and that's due to the activism of people like Alberta Schenck, but also there was another woman who was who played a key role in this activism, Elizabeth Peratrovich. So she was a Tlingit president of the Alaska Native Sisterhood, and she was actually there when the bill was signed by Gruning for the Anti-Discrimination Act.
Yeah. And just for like timeline's sake, Alberta's incident happened in 1944 in the spring, and then it was a year later in February when the bill was passed, which is pretty interesting. And yeah, Earnest Gruning, one of UAF's own, helped pass that. So it's pretty interesting. It's also interesting. I was reading on the consequences now. So like if you did commit a racist, I guess, crime or discriminatory crime, you would either get fined $4,000, and that's $4,000 in terms of our current market, so $250 back in 1945, or 30 days in prison, which I think is, I guess it's interesting to see those consequences being played out, and that it wasn't just, oh, we'll put together a bill that says this isn't okay, but we're gonna, loosen the penalties. It's nice to see it. Things actually went forward in the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty strict penalty, and I think that aids in allowing Alaska Native people to have more rights within the state.
Yeah.
And definitely is a good thing to see that it wasn't just like a we signed a bill kind of movement. It was like a we signed a bill and you will be punished if you commit discriminatory acts.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you think about Alaska being ahead of the curve in civil rights, there's another example of this. Ketchikan High School became an integrated school after a lawsuit by Tlingit leaders in 1929, a quarter century before a similar thing happened in Brown versus Board of Education. And so that's really interesting. It's another example of the Alaskan Native civil rights movement happening well far ahead of the lower 48 American civil rights movement. I find that very interesting.
Yeah, that is cool. Do we have any other talking points to finish up on today?
Not really. I think the other thing to consider is just the fact that we haven't learned about this, and maybe also why Alaska is not talked about much today in terms of the greater picture, in terms of other things relating to the United States.
Yeah.
I guess it's an interesting thing to think about, in that even in Alaskan education in high school, it's not really until we took this course that any of us were aware of this sort of movement and of the effect that Alaska Native people were able to have on lawmaking in the early days. So I think it comes to mind that maybe the education system, especially in Alaska, should reflect the history of the state and the importance of Alaska, rather than necessarily reflecting the lower 48, who seem to sort of leave us as an afterthought sometimes.
I think you can bring up great points, because in our discussions, I noticed that a lot, especially among Alaskan students. I feel like it was pretty common for all of us to agree on that matter. And it's definitely something I think about in the midst of, certain books are being banned, certain, class topics aren't being taught in certain states, for example, in Florida. With the education funding always lacking and continuing to lack in Alaska's future, it's something that's on my mind, I think, especially for, at the very least, high schoolers, where they have the, the brains and the matured minds to really understand these topics. I feel like in my own experience, I learned about the Revolutionary War 3 times. At least it was taught to me 3 times, and I kind of wish one of those was replaced with a full-on, Alaskan history, course of some kind. So, yeah. Any other thoughts before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think you did a great job with that conclusion, Nolan.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening. We hope you all have a great end of the year. Happy holidays. Hope the finals finish up well. And have a good one.
Happy solstice.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.